Good evening, everyone. Very pleased to be here this evening. And earlier we were speaking, a couple of the speakers were talking about how we should introduce ourselves. And I just wanted to start with a story. I recall a time when I was 8 years old, at the Christmas concert at the church. And I remember that point in the time where you're standing up and looking out into the audience with your microphone, and mom and dad were there, and then you quickly ran off the stage, never to be seen again. I'm not going to do that tonight. So I wanted to start by introducing myself. My parents are Janelle, Craig, Pierre, Morin. I have 3 siblings, Peter, Robert, and Kathleen. My brother Peter actually lives here in Toronto, so I was super excited to see him and his friend Ayumi. But I also want to acknowledge that I too am here for future generations. We have big responsibilities to make sure that as caretakers of this land, we're looking after things. And that's a large part of the work that I do. So I also wanted to take this opportunity as well to introduce you to where I come from. Tahltan territory. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Takes my breath away every time I go there. Quite often I say, similar to other Tahltans, my heartbeat, it just changes as soon as I cross the border. And so the pictures that you're seeing tonight behind me are different scenes from Tahltan territory. They're pictures of my teachers, of my family, friends, and it really, for me, resonates about the work that I do, which I truly love. So the other thing to know about Tahltan territory, and there's I'm sure a few people here that are familiar, along with its beauty, it offers a significant amount of different resources of interest, including mineral resources. So for those who don't know, it's actually known in the mining industry as the Golden Triangle. So we have a lengthy history with mining. And so we as Tahltans have, over the years, developed a number of tools and teams to address the questions that I know lots of Indigenous people ask themselves. They ask themselves questions like, is the water safe? Is this change in landscape and the dust, is it going to affect the animals? Is it going to affect us? When a mine closes, what kinds of consideration do they give to the local environment, to the local people that live there? So thinking about that and thinking about my background, I've been heavily influenced by not only being in Tahltan territory, being on the land, fishing. We spent a lot of summers picking blueberries and other traditional medicines. But I'm also influenced by my father's background as well. My father worked in resource development my entire life. He was a certified millwright. And so I knew much early on that there was a real opportunity for me to take the skills that I know, that I've been born, I've grown up with, plus my understanding of resource development, and work towards sustainable futures for the environment. So my background, I spend a great deal of my time working with Indigenous governments on resource development projects, and I have a background in engineering from the University of British Columbia. So when I talk about how we blend together not only things like engineering and Indigenous knowledge, we need to understand, and I'm sure lots of people ask this question, what is Indigenous knowledge? What is traditional ecological knowledge? Well, I can tell you that it's a bunch of, it's different for different nations, for different people, but it's learned knowledge that's passed down through generations. It is thinking about and adapting to change, and it includes things like relationships between people and the environment, the water, the wildlife, the air that we breathe. And, you know, it's one thing to look at it from a holistic perspective, because that's quite often what we do as Indigenous people. But how does one then start to think about how you would integrate that into a resource development project, into planning in different phases of project development? Well, we can look at specific aspects of traditional ecological knowledge. And there are Indigenous groups that can, like, I know that Tahltan often don't like to use the word traditional, because for some it suggests something that's happened in the past. But really, it's traditional for me talks about, the strength of something that's been with us for multiple generations. And also consider the fact that it's adaptable. We've built that into how we teach each other about the land and the environment. So when thinking about different aspects of traditional ecological knowledge, we think about things like observations, right? How many moose did we see? What did the moose look like? Where did they travel? Where did we hunt this particular moose? All of this kind of information, which is similar to what you can see in science in a wildlife population study. But think about it over multiple generations. People talking about, well, this is our specific hunting ground. This is typically how many moose we see. We think that that type of observational analysis and things like scientific wildlife population studies, they can go hand in hand. Other aspects of traditional ecological knowledge include things like environmental management systems. A number of First Nations or Indigenous people also have different systems of fire management, different systems of wildlife management that has been learned information, learned systems over generations. I'm just going to take a minute to look at my notes. Another important aspect of traditional ecological knowledge is, of course, ethics and values. So when we start to get taught about ecological knowledge or traditional knowledge, it's about the valuation and the importance of the land. And this kind of information quite often can come up through the review of a project in an environmental assessment. I am sure that there are many that have heard in the past about places where Indigenous people do not want to see development activity take place. And part of it is because of the concerns regarding potential impacts to the local environment. Another important aspect that we need to think about as well is cultural identity. Things like different landscape features with specific names and stories associated with them. I had the opportunity to work through the Prosperity Project, and one of the things that we heard from the Chilcotin people is stories about the landscape associated with places like Testandbini, and knowing that if these aspects of the landscape were changed, the story in itself would change or potentially go away. So these are the things that people think about, or Indigenous people think about, when faced with the prospect of project development in areas or landscapes that have significant cultural identity. So, what role can traditional ecological knowledge play in resource development, we ask ourselves? Well, I've seen traditional ecological knowledge actually provide project certainty in situations where there are gaps in project modeling or scientific work that's taken place. Sometimes the information provided by the local traditional knowledge holders can fill those gaps. Another important point to make as well is that traditional ecological knowledge can tell you where there are specific values on the landscape and where there are not. And when you're thinking about project development, it's important to know about these risks prior to proceeding with project planning, project development. So, how have we applied this for Tahltan? Well, earlier we talked a little bit about the fact that Tahltan have experienced a great deal of resource development activity in our traditional territory. In the last 10 years, there has been the development of a number of major mines, transmission line, run-of-river hydro projects. And so it was really important for us to ensure that our knowledge systems were part of this kind of project development. In 2005, our leadership of the day created the Tahltan Heritage Resource Environmental Assessment Team, known to both industry and government as THREAT. We don't like to call it that anymore, mostly because, it's really about collaboration. It's really about working together to find a solution. The knowledge that THREAT brings to the table is a balance between both Western science and local Tahltan knowledge. And for me, it's been a very interesting journey to work with the team that I've had the opportunity to work with, because what we have are local Tahltan knowledge holders, elders, but we also have professional people with degrees in things like archaeology, engineering. And the collaboration that we see there is almost a natural fit. It's almost a natural evolution between Tahltan knowledge, or traditional ecological knowledge, and Western science. So the responsibility of THREAT is to review project developments and provide advice to the Tahltan leadership. So we go through the exercise of undertaking impact analysis of these projects based on Tahltan knowledge and community engagement, community input. And based on this report, on this assessment, we're able to provide or recommend potential mitigation options, and then we report back to government, to industry, and as well as to our nation. So it's always important, it's key to ensure that that communication at all levels is always ongoing. And where are we going with this today? Well, the evolution has been quite interesting, because through the work of SRET, we've been able to create a Tahltan knowledge database based on a study that was done by our past leadership in the 80s, which has over 8,000 points of Tahltan knowledge data. 8,000 points, or to a Tahltan, different trails, different past communities, sites, places where berries were picked and people hunted, places where people fished. And with this information, we've been able to develop tools that have helped us to further define what would constitute an impact from a potential resource development project. We've used this information to create our own internal referrals processes, and we've been able to advance our work with both proponents and the provincial government around referrals and engagement. Other advancements include things like our Wildlife Guardian program as well. It's something that we're starting to see across Canada with different Indigenous nations who are now getting back out on the land, and they're managing and stewarding and looking after things. And really, it's a combination of activities that's taking place. It's some environmental monitoring, water sampling, but it's also opportunities for elders and traditional knowledge holders to teach the youth about how to properly steward their traditional lands. For many projects in Tahltan territory, we also require that traditional knowledge studies be done. And I'm sure it's something that many are familiar with, and it's actually starting to become part of the work in a more formalized way of things like environmental assessment processes for projects. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to close and to say that I believe that the stewardship of the lands are everyone's responsibility. And the idea that things like climate change and us not stewarding the lands and the impacts that we're seeing almost on a daily basis, I think that if we collectively work together, we can turn that around. And we need to do that for the future generations. Madhu.